What's been happening at universities lately? I mean, aside from the bloody riots, the physical attacks on visiting speakers, the expulsion of male students on nonsensical charges, the anti-Trump hysteria, and the safe space infantilism. What's been happening is the steady dumbing down of the entire institution to the point at which one has to ask, are academics smart? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. Universities have become quasi-religious institutions in which faith in doctrines like rape culture and male privilege has become more important than intellectual integrity. This has been going on for years, and it's going to keep getting worse. A few weeks ago, a story out of Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada, revealed that a sociology instructor explicitly directed a student in an email that the student was wrong to want to write a paper on the pay gap myth, and that instead the student should write a paper on the feminist doctrine of the glass ceiling, relying exclusively on feminist sources. Quote, "Do not use business sources," the screenshot shows the instructor telling the student. Why not? Quote, "They blame women. The reality is patriarchy." The instructor went on to say, "You need to do a lot of research. Feminists have been writing about the gender division of labor, the feminization of work, and the glass ceiling since the 1970s. There is a ton of feminist research on this topic." When the student's sister posted the email on Facebook, it went viral and became a news story. For those of you who don't operate in the corridors of moral rectitude and pious thought that is academia today, that seemed a shocking revelation of instructor bias. What happened to teaching students how to research rather than telling them what position to take and what ideologically pure sources to use? But for those of us who do reside in academia's hallowed halls, the email wasn't a shock. The only thing at all remarkable about it was the ungrammaticality of the instructor's prose. Now, I know email encourages an abbreviated mode of writing, but this was outright incompetent, and I think that incompetence is at least as shocking as the blatant ideological bias. Let's look at the email for a minute. Note that it was written almost entirely in simplistic 5 to 6 word sentences. Some of them, like "the reality is patriarchy," pretty much indistinguishable from the feminist slogans we've all seen recently on Women's March banners, often adorned with large pink female sexual organs. Now, perhaps it's acceptable now to write like a student, advocating, quote, "a ton of research," but one would expect basic precision of word use and coherent phrasing, at least when it comes to the actual subject matter. Not so here. The student is told that there is a, quote, "gender division of labor." That's wrong. It should be the past participial adjective, gendered, ed at the end. I mean, gender division sounds like a squad of feminist zealots telling us which pronouns we're allowed to use. The student is also told that feminists research something called the feminization of work. Now, if there's anyone in sociology out there, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty confident this is not the correct phrase. If high-level work were being feminized, presumably that would be a good thing from the feminist point of view and would be the solution to the glass ceiling, but clearly that's not what's being referred to here. Now imagine this instructor who can't write an intelligible email evaluating student work. How would the instructor explain in writing how a student had gone wrong in a paper? Would papers be evaluated for cogency of argument and depth of analysis, or mainly for ideological correctness? Would this instructor be capable of fairly evaluating a paper that took a position with which she or he was not in agreement? It's hard to say for sure on the basis of one email, but the signs aren't encouraging. Just a few days after this, we saw a different example, but a related incident regarding outrageous bias and intellectual mediocrity. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Canada's taxpayer-funded television news and culture station, aired a segment about the cancellation of a screening of The Red Pill. That's Cassie Jay's sympathetic documentary about the men's movement. As some of you know, the film has been heavily protested all across the world. And in this case, the film was cancelled at the University of Calgary in Alberta after a student with a conservative political group on campus promoted the film using the phrase, "Feminism is cancer," in an email. If the student had said, "Mohammed farts," he couldn't have caused more consternation amongst the community of the righteous at the U of Calgary. In fact, probably that's the only other thing he might have said that would have caused equal upset. The promotion of a men's rights movie set a lot of feminists running for their smelling salts and gasping in their corsets on campus. The CBC brought in a feminist professor, Dr. Rebecca Sullivan. Professor Sullivan told us all how, quote, scary it was for her to wake up in the morning and hear about this incident, even though, as Karen Strawn has pointed out, what she was hearing about was how the communications director had to resign and everybody apologized profusely for daring to say something rude about feminism. I wish I had that kind of scary to deal with. Now, I was under the impression that Dr. Sullivan, the middle-aged academic who perjured herself on our state-funded broadcaster, was a women's studies professor, but as far as I can tell, she's technically part of the English department at the University of Calgary. She's a specialist in feminist theory and media studies, and she has published one book and a number of co-authored books, mainly on Canadian television. Now, I just said that Professor Sullivan perjured herself, which of course isn't true, as she wasn't testifying in a court of law. But symbolically, she did. She came onto the show as an expert in the representation of gender. She came on to discuss one thing, the cancellation of a screening of the film The Red Pill, and she did so without even having seen the film. No one watching this interview who has seen The Red Pill could legitimately link Professor Sullivan's bizarre and fantastical statements with anything that's actually in the film, which is about issues such as discrimination against men in divorce, the differential treatment of men under the criminal code, men's much higher suicide rate, and so on. What did Professor Sullivan think she was doing discussing the film as if she had seen it and making statements about it that had nothing to do with the film? According to the learned professor, the men's rights message as portrayed in The Red Pill is, and it's this incredible, quote, "If only we could have sex with whoever and whatever we want, whenever we want, then maybe we wouldn't have to rape you," end quote. After which she and the interviewer sniggered companionably. Now, there are already a number of response videos by Karen Strawn and Paul Elam and a wonderful Australian with a skull avatar, for example, that take apart Professor Sullivan's comments to show how farcical they were. So I will say only that if you had tried to present a caricature of academic feminist misrepresentation of the men's rights movement, you couldn't have done a better job than what Professor Sullivan came up with, which she didn't even attempt to anchor in any single utterance by any self-identified men's rights activist. In fact, if you were trying to write a caricature and had produced what Professor Sullivan did, you might have thought it went too far, that it sounded too much like Andrea Dworkin at her most unhinged. Except that Andrea Dworkin, who was genuinely very smart, if deranged, would never have been so much at a loss for words, so quick to retreat into nonsensical chuckles, raised eyebrows, coy facial expressions, exaggerated winks, grins, snide giggles, head bobbing, and grimaces. Just as in the Ryerson University case, there isn't anything surprising in a feminist professor saying demonstrably untrue things about the men's rights movement. But it was noteworthy how very badly she said those untrue things. This is a PhD in communications. Yet her language was so simplistic, so vacuous, so juvenile. Quote, "It was scary, and I think we need to name it as scary," she said about the phrase "feminism is cancer." Perhaps she was simply having a bad day. I can sympathize with that. Anyone who's watched me in a Q&A know that I can be slow and tongue-tied. But Professor Sullivan's level of crude obtuseness of the first-year art student mouth breather variety was really remarkable. And this is my point. Try to conceive of turning on the television 50 years ago for an interview with a university professor and finding such a low level of discussion with such little regard for accuracy or fairness or even basic verbal competency. The advent of feminism and other social justice ideologies has profoundly corroded the intellectual legitimacy of much of academia for two reasons. First, academic work is now overwhelmingly about conformity of thought rather than intellectual inquiry. Real scholarly inquiry is curiosity-driven, not agenda-driven. But sadly, academia is not any longer an institution in which high intelligence is the primary qualification. Second, to make matters worse, the drive over the past 30 years to hire women and other designated groups into positions in which their primary mandate is to talk about the difficulties of being who they are, how scary it is. That has inevitably attracted women such as Rebecca Sullivan and many others who have very little of substance to offer. The result is an appalling corruption of research, evisceration of content, gutting of standards, and overt politicization of academic subjects. Rebecca Sullivan and her many colleagues are scary, and I think we have to name them as such.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please support us on Patreon. If even half of our subscribers gave us $1 per month, we'd be well on our way to creating more and better content. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Studio Brule.